The sanctuary, the sound of hammering echoed across the valley, each strike deliberate and measured. Jacob Thornfield had been mending the same fence for 3 days now, not because it needed that much attention, but because the rhythmic work kept his mind from wandering to places he'd rather not visit. At 52, he'd grown accustomed to solitude on his sprawling Montana ranch, where the nearest neighbor lived 12 miles away and conversations were limited to the occasional exchange with the feed store clerk in town. The October morning was crisp, painting his breath in small clouds as he worked. His border collie, Scout, suddenly lifted his head from where he'd been resting in the shade of the fence post, ears pricked forward with an alertness that made Jacob pause mid-swing. "What is it, boy?" Jacob murmured, following the dog's gaze toward the old Henderson property that bordered his land to the east. The place had been abandoned for years, ever since old Pete Henderson passed away and his good-for-nothing nephew inherited it. Jacob had heard rumors that someone was living there now, Pete's brother's family fallen on hard times, but he'd never seen hide nor hair of them. Scout whined low in his throat, a sound Jacob had learned to trust over their 8 years together. The dog was rarely wrong about trouble. Setting down his hammer, Jacob shaded his eyes against the morning sun and squinted toward the Henderson place. Nothing seemed amiss from this distance, just the same weathered barn and the cluster of outbuildings slowly surrendering to time and neglect. But Scout was insistent, trotting a few steps toward the property line before looking back at Jacob expectantly. Against his better judgment, he'd learned years ago that getting involved in other people's business only led to heartache. Jacob found himself climbing over the fence and following his dog across the dry grass that separated the two properties. As they drew closer to the Henderson buildings, Jacob could make out signs of recent habitation, fresh tire tracks in the dirt, a thin line of smoke rising from the main house's chimney, and laundry hanging stiff on a makeshift clothesline. But something else caught his attention, a sound that made his blood run cold. Faint but unmistakable, the sound of someone crying. Scout led him directly to a small storage shed tucked behind the main barn, and as they approached, Jacob could hear the soft, desperate sobbing more clearly. What he saw next would be burned into his memory forever. The shed door wasn't just closed, it was sealed shut, with boards nailed across it, and through the gaps between the weathered planks, he could see movement in the darkness within. "Hello," Jacob called out, his voice rougher than intended. "Is someone in there?" The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a fearful silence that somehow felt worse. "I'm not going to hurt you," Jacob said more gently, approaching the shed carefully. "My name is Jacob. I live on the ranch next door." "Are you hurt?" A small voice, barely above a whisper, replied. Please don't tell him you found me. He said if anyone tried to help me, he'd make it worse." Jacob's hands clenched into fists. In 30 years of living on this land, he'd seen his share of cruelty. Nature could be harsh, and people could be harsher, but this was something else entirely. "I'm going to get you out of there," he said, already examining the boards. They were freshly nailed, the wood still showing pale scars where the hammer had struck. "What's your name?" "Sarah," came the trembling reply. "Sarah Winters. I'm 17. Jacob's heart hammered against his ribs. 7. Just a kid, and someone had locked her in this shed like an animal. "How long have you been in there, Sarah?" "Since yesterday morning. Maybe longer. I can't. It's hard to tell." Working as quickly and quietly as he could, Jacob used the claw end of his hammer to pry the boards loose. Each nail seemed to protest with a sharp screech of metal against wood, and he winced at every sound, knowing that whoever had done this might return at any moment. When the last board came free, Jacob pulled the door open and stepped back to give the girl space. What emerged was a sight that would haunt him. A thin, pale young woman with matted brown hair and clothes that hung loose on her frame. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of relief and terror, and she clutched a thin blanket around her shoulders like armor. "Sarah," Jacob said softly, crouching down to her level, "you're safe now. Nobody's going to hurt you anymore." She looked at him with the wariness of a wild animal, as if kindness itself might be a trap. You don't understand, she whispered. Uncle Ray, he said this was my punishment for trying to run away. If he finds out you helped me, where is he now? Jacob asked, glancing toward the main house. Gone to town. He said he'd be back by dinner, and if I'd learned my lesson maybe he'd let me out. Her voice broke on the last word. Jacob made a decision that would change both their lives. You're coming home with me, he said firmly. Right now, I can't. He'll find me. He'll find you. And then, she shuddered, unable to finish the thought. Sarah, look at me. Jacob waited until her frightened eyes met his. I've been taking care of myself on this land for a long time. I'm not afraid of your uncle, and I won't let him hurt you again. But we need to go now, before he comes back. Something in his voice must have convinced her, because after a long moment, she nodded. Jacob helped her to her feet, noting how she winced with each movement. Scout, who had been waiting patiently nearby, approached slowly, and gently pressed his nose against her hand. For the first time since Jacob had found her, Sarah almost smiled. He likes you, Jacob observed. Scout's a good judge of character. The journey back to Jacob's ranch house felt like the longest half-mile of his life. Sarah moved slowly, clearly in pain, and kept looking over her shoulder as if expecting pursuit. Jacob found himself doing the same, his protective instincts fully awakened for the first time in years. His house was modest but clean, a 2-story log structure he'd built himself with help from a few neighbors back when he still believed in community and shared purposes. The kitchen was the heart of the home, with a large wooden table that had seen countless solitary meals and a stone fireplace that could heat the entire downstairs when properly tended. Sit, Jacob said, pulling out a chair at the kitchen table. When did you last eat? Sarah lowered herself carefully into the chair, still clutching her blanket. Day before yesterday, I think. Uncle Ray said I didn't deserve food until I apologized for being ungrateful. Jacob bit back the words that rose in his throat. Instead, he busied himself in the kitchen preparing a simple meal of scrambled eggs, toast, and the kind of strong coffee that had sustained him through countless early mornings. As he cooked, he stole glances at Sarah, noting the way she held herself, careful, guarded, ready to flee at the first sign of danger. This is too much, she protested when he set the plate in front of her. Eat what you can, Jacob replied, settling into the chair across from her with his own plate. Your body needs fuel to heal. They ate in companionable silence, broken only by Scout's gentle snoring from his place by the fire. Jacob watched as Sarah slowly began to relax, her shoulders dropping away from her ears as the warm food and warmth of the kitchen worked their magic. Why are you helping me? She asked suddenly, setting down her fork. Jacob considered the question. Why was he helping her? The simple answer was that it was the right thing to do, but there was more to it than that. Something about her reminded him of himself at that age, lost, alone, and convinced that the world was full of people who would hurt you if given the chance. Because someone should have helped me when I was your age, he said finally, and because leaving you there wasn't an option. Sarah studied his face, searching for something. What happened to you? Jacob had spent decades perfecting the art of avoiding that particular conversation, but something about this girl's direct gaze made his usual deflections seem inadequate. My father had a temper, he said quietly, and a drinking problem, and a belief that the best way to raise a son was to beat the weakness out of him. He met her eyes. I left home at 17, just like you're trying to do. Difference was, I had somewhere to go. Where did you go? Military. Spent 10 years seeing the world, learning that there were worse things than my father's fists, and better things than I'd ever imagined. He gestured around the kitchen. Came back here after my discharge, bought this land with my savings, and built something better. And you've been alone all this time. Jacob felt the familiar ache in his chest, the one that came whenever he thought about the path not taken. There was someone once, a woman I met in town, school teacher named Elizabeth. We were together for 3 years, even talked about marriage. He paused, remembering, but I couldn't get past the idea that I'd just hurt her eventually, the way my father hurt my mother, so I pushed her away. Do you regret it? Every day. The admission surprised him with its honesty. But regret's a luxury I can't afford. All I can do is try to be better than I was yesterday. Sarah nodded as if she understood something beyond her years. Uncle Ray says I'm damaged goods, says no man will ever want me, so I might as well be grateful for the roof over my head and not ask for more. Your uncle is wrong, Jacob said with a quiet intensity that made her look up. You're not damaged, Sarah. You're hurt, and that's different. Hurt can heal. Over the next few hours, Jacob learned more of Sarah's story. Her parents had died in a car accident 2 years earlier, leaving her in the care of her father's brother. Ray Winters was a bitter man who saw his niece as both a burden and an opportunity, someone to cook and clean and bear the brunt of his frustrations without complaint. When Sarah had tried to run away the previous week, he decided that conventional punishment wasn't enough. He said the shed would teach me to appreciate what I had. Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, said I could think about how much worse things could be while I was in there. As the afternoon wore on, Jacob found himself planning. He had enough money saved to support both of them, at least for a while. The ranch was self-sufficient in many ways, and he'd been thinking about hiring help anyway. Sarah could finish her last year of high school by correspondence. He'd look into that. Most importantly, she'd be safe here, away from anyone who would hurt her. But first, they had to deal with Ray Winters. As if summoned by Jacob's thoughts, the sound of a truck engine cut through the quiet afternoon air. Scout's head shot up and he moved to the window with a low growl. Jacob followed, peering through the curtain to see a battered pickup truck pulling into his driveway. It's him, Sarah breathed, appearing at Jacob's shoulder. Oh God, it's Uncle Ray. How did he know? Jacob could see the man now, tall, thin, with the kind of angular face that seemed designed for sneer. Ray Winters climbed out of his truck with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no, and Jacob felt his own protective instincts surge. Stay here, he told Sarah, moving toward the door. Whatever happens, don't come outside. Jacob, please be careful. He has a gun. Jacob paused, his hand on the doorknob. So do I, and unlike your uncle, I know how to use it. The confrontation on Jacob's front porch was brief but definitive. Ray Winters had come expecting to intimidate a solitary rancher into giving up his property, because that's how he saw Sarah, as something he owned. What he found instead was a man who'd spent 10 years in the military, and 30 more defending what was his. She's my niece, Ray snarled, his hand hovering near the pistol tucked into his belt. Her parents left her to me, legal and proper. You got no right to interfere. I have every right to help an abused child, Jacob replied calmly, his own hand resting casually on the shotgun he'd brought from inside. And if you think for 1 second that I'm going to let you take her back to that shed, you're mistaken. You don't know what you're dealing with, old man. That girl's nothing but trouble. She needs a firm hand. What she needs is to be treated like a human being. Jacob's voice dropped to a register that made even the birds fall silent. Now you have 2 choices. You can get in your truck and drive away, and we'll never speak of this again. Or you can try to take her, and we'll see how that works out for you. Ray's eyes flicked between Jacob's face and the shotgun, clearly calculating his odds. What he saw in Jacob's expression must have convinced him, because after a long moment, he spat in the dirt and backed toward his truck. This ain't over, he called out as he climbed behind the wheel. She's family, and family looks after family. She's safe now, Jacob replied. That's all the family she needs. As the truck disappeared down the driveway, Jacob felt some of the tension leave his shoulder. It wouldn't be the last they heard from Ray Winters. Men like that didn't give up easily. But it was a start. Inside, he found Sarah huddled in the kitchen chair where he'd left her, tears streaming down her face. He's gone, Jacob said gently, setting the shotgun aside and moving to the stove to make tea. And he's not taking you anywhere, but he'll come back. He'll bring the sheriff or social services, or let him try. Jacob set a steaming mug in front of her. You're 17, Sarah. In most states, that's old enough to choose where you want to live, and I've got documentation of what he did to you that shed your condition when I found you. Any reasonable person would see that you're better off here. Over the following weeks, Jacob's prediction proved accurate. Ray made several attempts to reclaim his niece, involving various authorities and legal threats, but each effort fell apart when confronted with the evidence of his abuse and Sarah's clear preference to remain with Jacob. Eventually,
Even Ray seemed to accept that his meal ticket and punching bag were gone for good. Sarah began to heal slowly but surely. The physical recovery came first. Proper meals and a warm bed worked wonders for someone who'd been systematically undernourished and denied basic comfort. But the emotional healing took longer, and Jacob found himself learning patience he didn't know he possessed. There were nightmares, nights when Sarah would wake screaming, and Jacob would find her barricaded in her room, convinced that her uncle had returned. There were days when she flinched away from sudden movements or loud noises, and meals where she ate as if someone might take the food away at any moment. But there were good moments too. The first time Sarah laughed at one of Scout's antics, Jacob felt something in his chest he hadn't experienced in years. When she started helping with the ranch work tentatively at first, then with growing confidence, he saw glimpses of the strong, capable woman she was becoming. "I used to think about what I'd do if I ever got away," she told him one evening, as they sat on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains, purple and gold. "I had all these plans where I'd go, what I'd do, but I never imagined anything like this." "What's this?" Jacob asked, though he thought he knew. "Safe," she said simply. "I never imagined feeling safe." Jacob nodded, understanding completely. Safety was a luxury he'd taken for granted until he'd lost it, and found again only by building walls high enough and strong enough to keep the world at bay. But Sarah had taught him something he'd never expected to learn. Sometimes the walls were meant to keep people in, not out. As winter settled over the ranch, Sarah finished her high school coursework through a correspondence program Jacob had arranged. She was brighter than her circumstances had ever allowed her to show, and threw herself into her studies with the determination of someone who finally had a future to plan for. "I want to study veterinary medicine," she announced one snowy evening, looking up from her biology textbook. "Is that crazy?" "Nothing about wanting to help animals is crazy," Jacob replied, though privately he wondered how they'd manage the cost of veterinary school. "Dr. Martinez in town might be willing to let you volunteer at his clinic, get some experience. You'd be okay with that?" "Me being gone during the day?" Jacob looked at her, really looked at her, and was struck by how much she'd changed in just a few months. The frightened, broken girl he'd found in that shed was still there, but she was overlaid now with something stronger, hope. "Sarah, you're not my prisoner," he said gently. "You're free to come and go as you please, to make your own choices about your future. I hope you'll choose to stay here as long as you want to, but that's your decision to make." "I do want to stay," she said quickly, then seemed to catch herself. "I mean, if you want me to. I know I'm probably a burden." "Stop." Jacob's voice was firm but kind. "You're not a burden. He struggled to find the right words. "You're the best thing that's happened to this place in years. To me, if I'm being honest." That spring, as Sarah began volunteering at Dr. Martinez's clinic, and Jacob started planning improvements to the ranch that would accommodate a permanent second resident, they received an unexpected visitor. Elizabeth Morrison stood on Jacob's front porch, older than he remembered but still beautiful in a way that made his heart skip beats. She was a widow now, she explained, and had heard about his situation through the town grapevine. "I came to see if you needed help," she said, though her eyes were asking a different question entirely. Sarah, who had been listening from the kitchen, appeared in the doorway with Scout at her side. "You must be Elizabeth," she said warmly. "Jacob's told me about you." "Has?" Elizabeth's surprise was evident. "He said you were the one who got away," Sarah continued, either oblivious to, or deliberately ignoring Jacob's mortified expression. "But I think maybe you were the one he let go." Over dinner that night, Jacob found himself telling Elizabeth the full story, about finding Sarah, about the confrontation with Ray, about the months of healing and growth that had followed. He watched her face as he spoke, looking for judgment or disapproval, but finding only understanding. "You saved her," Elizabeth said simply when he finished. "She saved me too," Jacob replied, surprising himself with the admission. "I didn't even realize how empty this place was until she filled it." "And what happens now?" Jacob looked at Sarah, who was studiously pretending not to listen while she cleared the dinner dishes. "Now we keep building. Sarah's got college to think about, and I've got a ranch that could use some expanding. Maybe even room for a few more strays if any come along." "And room for anyone else?" Elizabeth asked, quietly. Jacob met her eyes, seeing in them the same hope he felt building in his own chest. "I think there might be," he said. if she were willing to take a chance on a stubborn old rancher who spent too many years alone. As summer arrived, the ranch settled into a new rhythm. Sarah divided her time between her studies and her work at the veterinary clinic, clearly thriving in both environments. Elizabeth had moved into the small guest cabin Jacob had built years earlier, but never used, and their relationship was growing slowly, carefully, built on a foundation of shared experiences and mutual respect. One evening, as the three of them sat on the expanded front porch Jacob had built to accommodate their growing household, Sarah looked up from her anatomy textbook and asked, "Do you think Uncle Ray was right about me being damaged?" Jacob and Elizabeth exchanged glances. It was Elizabeth who answered, her voice gentle but firm. "Damage implies something broken beyond repair," she said. "What I see when I look at you is someone who's been through hell and came out stronger. That's not damage, sweetheart. That's resilience." "Besides," Jacob added, "even if you were damaged, which you're not, that would just mean you were in good company. We're all a little broken in our own ways. The trick is finding people who love you not despite your cracks, but because they understand." Sarah smiled, the real smile that Jacob had come to treasure over the months they'd lived together. "I love you too," she said simply. "Both of you. I never thought I'd have a family again, but this feels like family." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Jacob reflected on the unexpected turns his life had taken. A year ago he'd been a man convinced that solitude was safety, that caring for others only led to pain. Now he sat surrounded by the two most important people in his world, planning a future that included veterinary school tuition, wedding preparations, and the possibility of more lost souls finding their way to this sanctuary he'd built, without realizing it. "You know what the best part is?" Sarah said, as if reading his thoughts. "What's that?" Jacob asked. "Ray thought he was punishing me by putting me in that shed, but if he hadn't done that you never would have found me. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you leads directly to the best thing." Jacob nodded, understanding completely. Sometimes salvation came in the most unexpected forms. A crying voice from a boarded-up shed, a second chance with a lost love, a family built not from blood but from choice and commitment. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Scout settled himself across the feet of all three humans, and Jacob knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The sanctuary he'd built to protect himself had become something greater, a place where broken things could heal, where lost souls could find home, and where love could grow in even the most unlikely soil. The loner rancher was alone no more, and he wouldn't have it any other way.